to that problem of the day. Today is election day, as I mentioned, for many of us. So our problem of the day says, what does it mean to have a margin of error of 4 points if the pre-election poll says 45% voted for a certain candidate? And once again, we remind you to vote. You still got some time out there, a couple hours left on most schedules there. I know in East Tennessee we are until 8 p.m., and I'm assuming that's probably the same way it is out there in Middle Tennessee. But get out there and do that voting if you haven't already today. Again, what does it mean to have a margin of error of 4 points this time if the pre-election poll says 45% voted for a candidate? So let's take a little look at this. I've kind of taken a few of there was a lot of stuff in there. I've taken a little bit of it out, and then we're going to bring that back in. First of all, we're going to say that we have a poll that has said we had 45% that voted for a certain candidate. Now, pre-election, if you take the actual ballot box, there is no margin of error. You count them up right, and you've got a number, all right? This is for pre-election polls, first of all. So we really think of polls not going to the polls as much anymore. That's the ballot box. That's the final outcome. That's the election, all right? The polls are happening beforehand. So that's what we're talking about here. And I want you to notice something. There are a lot of things that basically lead to this margin of error. I'm not going to take a lot of time with that, but what happens is if we're saying that we're going to call this thing, we'll call it p-hat. Good old statistical terms. Some of you out there in the statistics class say, ooh, wee, yeah. That means it's a predicted p, all right? It's a predicted percentage or proportion. And what it's going to do is going to be plus or minus this margin of error. And you say, well, Ernie, what does that mean by margin of error? That's a little bit of leeway. In other words, and I say plus or minus. In other words, we could be a little bit above, we could be a little bit below based on our sample. We're going to make a sample, and that's why this is a sample statistic right there. Give me a quick overview of sample statistics. I'm not going to go to everything about the margin of error, but some things that are going to be important is how confident do we want to be? We want to be 95% confident that we can get that margin of error. Do we want to be 90% confident? A little bit smaller error, but it allows me to be wrong 10% of the time, all right? Or about 10% of the time. We never can say exactly 10% with statistics. My principal calls it fuzzy math, all right? But it is kind of fuzzy, but it gives us a little bit of leeway because nothing in advance is exactly able to predict exactly. But what we can do is figure out a little bit of room to wiggle, so to speak. So we went with 45%. I'm going to change that to decimal, all right? And that's how we do it. We shift that decimal point 2 places. We're going to put plus or minus, and I believe the phrase was that we were going to have 4 percentage points. Now you say, well, Ernie, how do you figure out those 4 percentage points? Well, you've got to know how many are in a sample. In other words, if you sample 3 or 4 people, you're not going to get good results. But let's say you do, and by the way, the key word with sampling is random sampling. Totally simple random sample is the best way to go. Some sort of randomness has to be in the picture here. And the larger the sample, hey, the more opinions you get, the closer you're going to be to that percentage, the real deal. So you want to make that sample large. Sometimes you don't have that money, sometimes you don't have the resources, sometimes you just don't have the time, all right? But those are things that go in ingredients. So we want to know how confident are we? We call that a confidence level. We have a standard deviation that's going along, and that's based on this little guy right here. And importantly, as I said, the number of people that are in your sample. So all of that goes, but we want to get to the point here. What does this mean? Because notice I said plus or minus. So that means we could be 4 points above with the plus, or we could be 4 points below. And then let's see how close this puts our candidate to a, well, simple majority even. So first of all, if we go plus, I'm going to put this in a kind of look at like an ordered pair. We'll go high, low, high first. So let's do what minus. That would give us, say, well, it could be, we feel like it could be as low as 41%. And also it could be as high as 49%. We hope it's a scientific poll, which means it was done by random sampling, not just by call-ins or things like that. That's another thing we've got to be very careful. If you ever hear a lot of your newscast, 6 o'clock, 11 o'clock news, they'll say this was not a scientific poll because people called in and there's no way of randomly selecting those people to give their answers. So you can't really take much trust on that. But if it's a randomized poll and it's got a good size sample, you can pretty much take some of this stuff to the house. Now, this tells me that candidate is expected to make somewhere between 41 and 49% for a given sample mean, all right? And it's going to all center around this 0.45, we think, or 4,500ths there. But the idea, this is how low we're going to give ourselves to go and how high. So we're basically saying this guy could have, or this lady, yeah, you know, we got a lot of these ladies running for that political office all these days, 41% or up to 49%. If there are two people running, this one needs a little bit more to make some good uncertainty in that race. Because if you get over 50 to 51 there, that really kind of says, wow, this is too close to call at this point. Because this one is probably still pretty close to call. So, by the way, watch your election results tonight and see if you hear any of those plus or minus percentages come into play. Probably not, because eventually they're going to call them, they're going to project winners based on the data as the percent of precincts report in, but eventually everyone gets counted. We call that a parameter instead of a statistic. So there you have it. A quick little roll through, and some of you are going like, more than I wanted to know. But at least I hope you understand when they take those polls before the election, they're giving some room for error, and it's not because they're going to make mistakes. It's basically because there's just chance involved with picking whatever sample you've got. So you've got that little leeway of how many ever points, depending, again, on sample size and a little thing called standard deviation.